War has been a defining characteristic of mankind for the entirety of recorded history, an ever-present way that conflict between societies has been resolved. For as long as warfare has existed, its unforgiving brutality has accompanied it. War turns ordinary men into soldiers. In order for men to survive the brutality of battle, they must become stoic machines of war, exercising absolute power over themselves and their environment. This hyper-masculine, Superman-like characterization of the ideal man projects itself from the military and onto society, eventually becoming the mold that all men, not just soldiers, are required to fill. Soldiers are conditioned by their governments to be warriors fighting for their country. This is done through extensive military training as well as exposure to propaganda. This can be seen especially throughout the 20th century and especially during World War II. Governments on all sides of war sought to instill in their men a sense of what the ideal soldier was. This image was often simply a personified version of the country's ideology. Stalin used movies to portray war heroes that embodied his ideological concept of what a Soviet soldier was supposed to be: unstoppable, fearless, and loyal. He called the Russian war effort against Nazi Germany the, quote, Great Patriotic War. The state military newspaper published slogans such as "Crush the fascist reptile" and "Revenge and death to Hitlerite scum." These were meant to inspire merciless destruction of the enemies of Russia. On the other hand, Nazi ideology held that Germans belonged to a superior race of people, known as Übermenschen, and were destined to rule over the perceived subhumans of Eastern Europe. Italian dictator Benito Mussolini focused his rhetoric on the idea of building what he called the, quote, New Roman Empire, a glorious state that would restore Italy to a place of power and prestige. Throughout history, leaders such as Mussolini have viewed warfare as a test of a country's worth. Consequently, soldiers were bombarded with the idea that to be worthy of their country, they had to fulfill their duty to crush all who opposed it. Battle was seen as a proving ground for men, in which only the strongest and most masculine survived. Therefore, propaganda was used to shape men into indestructible heroes of their nation. Posters, movies, pamphlets, etc. All forms of media were used during wartime to drill men into embodying the persona of the ideal soldier. This in turn created a concept of masculinity that was built around superiority and dominance. This masculinity can be maintained only by cold-blooded, ruthless determination and other characteristics typically classified as masculine, and an aversion to all things that compromise this, such as empathy and compassion, or in other words, traits typically classified as feminine. Soldiers who do not perfectly fit this established mold of masculinity are therefore seen as feminine and therefore weak. This type of mindset pressures soldiers into committing atrocities that they may have personally been against, such as the murder and sexual assault of thousands of civilians. In such an environment, brutality becomes a tool that soldiers use to prove themselves as soldiers and as men. War shapes society as well. Societies become militarized when there is no longer a clear separation between the nation's military and its everyday society and culture. In militarized societies, wartime conceptions of masculinity gradually become the generalized expectations that all men must live up to. Mussolini's concept of the New Roman Empire and his extreme obsession with war were also heavily based on his idea of a, quote, new man. This was essentially his version of the ideal male. The new man was to be simple, brutal, and powerful. There was no room for romanticism. As a result of Mussolini's hyper-masculine hypothetical hero, those who were not perceived as being manly enough, mainly urban artists, intellectuals, business owners, and so forth, were characterized as weak. Because the society of fascist Italy was so closely tied to warfare and conflict, such men had no place in it because they could not carry the nation to military victory. On the other hand, farmers and industrial workers were venerated as examples of what all Italian men should strive to be. This social perception of masculinity does not apply only to fascist Italy. The culture of the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany also heavily reflected these ideals because all civilian men were treated as soldiers in either a physical or ideological war between the nation and its enemies. However, this isn't something that is exclusive to authoritarian societies. The US during the Cold War is an example of how even a society that is founded on a free-thinking individualism can adopt a narrow-minded and collectivist concept of masculinity. Propaganda during and after World War II sought to rally support behind the US military by portraying it as an institution that embodied everything good about America, and as a global force for good in a world that was increasingly threatened by evil forces such as communism. This elevated the US military to a special place in American society. Soldiers were viewed as model Americans and as individuals without flaws. This instilled in American men that they should strive to resemble this kind of an image. As the US military grew in size and prestige, the standard of hypermasculinity that soldiers were expected to meet was now a standard that American men and boys were held to as well. When these standards of masculinity permeate a society, they eventually also make their way into the nation's cultural expectations and norms that men must abide by. Even when war and conflict no longer define a nation, the mindset that war creates throughout a society may still exist. Social psychologist Gert Hofstede created a model for analyzing cultures called the 6D, or six-dimensional model. In this model, Japan scores 95 out of 100 on the masculinity metric. This is due to the significant cultural impact that war has had on Japan for many centuries. Although Japan is not currently focused on warfare and military might, a hyper-masculine warrior mindset manifests itself in other ways, such as an extremely competitive and ruthless business culture. For comparison, Iceland scores a 10 out of 100 on this same metric. In a contemporary setting, the same ideas of dominance and power that have defined the gender identities of men during wartime now define the gender identities of men during peacetime. However, this expression of masculinity contributes to an obsession with individual wealth, status, and success more so than it contributes to a desire to triumph over a country's enemies. This conception of extreme masculinity polarizes a society's conceptions of gender. On one end of the spectrum is masculinity, and on the other is femininity, with very little room in between. This is also as detrimental to women as it is to men because masculine notions of dominance and control often contribute to the formation of a sexist and misogynistic society. However, this conception of masculinity is also without a doubt detrimental to men. The constant need to demonstrate toughness, control, and independence is a likely contributor to the fact that men commit suicide at a rate 3.5 times that of women. Men learn to have an aversion to all things that are labeled feminine because they associate these with weakness. In this example, struggling with emotional disorders is seen as something that denotes weakness and a lack of masculinity. This keeps certain men from seeking help in order to conform to a set gender identity and preserve their outward appearance of masculinity. Masculinity defines who men are, both in their own eyes as well as the eyes of others, by providing a character that they must resemble. In these ways, warfare reinforces in society the impossible standard that men must be invincible. Through the creation of an exaggerated archetype of masculinity, men are taught by their governments and societies that they must reject that which makes them human in order to pursue that which makes them men.